When people would ask what I did and I would say funeral director, they'd say, "Oh, you mean you put their makeup on?" And I'd say, "No, I'm actually a funeral director. I sit with the families and arrange funerals and do the embalming." "Oh, you don't really do that," they'd say. I don't know who people think does that, but it's a funeral director. My grandfather wrote for newspapers, a little column in a little local paper about what happened in the small town I grew up in. And that meant he reported on every death and every birth. And he influenced me a lot because we were at the funeral home a lot. And that's where my interest in funeral services came up. I was always interested as a child, even at the funeral home. I think my first trip to the funeral home to a visitation would have been at about 4 years old, because I remember being lifted up to look into the casket. And then as I got older, I would sneak into the director's office and look at the trade magazines while the family sat through the visiting hours. I had a deep respect for the funeral director. I know a lot of people don't think that way now that I've been there and can see other perspectives. People don't have that same respect. But in a small town, you went to the same man and you went to the same family generation after generation to care for your loved ones who died. So I had a deep respect for this man. He was right up there with Santa Claus. Yeah, he was. His name was Harry Ostrander in Tillsonburg, Ontario. When somebody died, you went to Ostrander's. There was another funeral home in town, but my family went to Ostrander's funeral home. I never remember a conversation with him. I never remember any kind of close contact as a child. You know, you went in holding your parents' hand, but it was the talk of him in the family. You know, well, we'll call Harry. You call him and he goes. Just that he provided a service for people when they were in great despair. As a kid, I saw him as being able to rescue those people from that, to provide them with a service to say goodbye. And when you're little, when somebody dies, that seems to be the biggest catastrophe ever, and he fixed it. Oddly enough, it turned out that where I grew up, the home I grew up in, was across the street from the home of the funeral director who had lived in the town generations before me. And the barn that my family owned was actually the barn where they kept the horses that drew the funeral carriage in town. And later in my experiences, I met the people who lived in that house. So I had actually had contact with the same buildings and played in the same lawn as the funeral director who had served the town I grew up in generations before. So it was very interesting, yeah. I think we all have that kind of curiosity around death. There was a certain kind of fear, but there was a curious fear about it as well. And that's what I find about a lot of people that I speak to now, is we all have this curiosity, but it's a fearful curiosity when it comes to funerals. You used to be able to buy a case of chemicals and you'd get your funeral director's license in the case. Yeah, yeah. So there's a lot to be said for regulated professions. There's a history of people who sold furniture also became the funeral directors because they made the caskets, things like that. Carpenters who had wood made the caskets, things like that. That was quite a while ago. So it's much different today, and it used to be seen as a family business, and that's not the case anymore. The first time it was like it wasn't even real. A human being brought into the funeral home and prepared, embalmed, ready for visitation. That was quite an experience that I will never forget. I think I went into shock after. I think it was, something you brace yourself for anyway. Even though I had been familiar with going to a funeral home and seeing the casket open, it's quite a different thing to see a human body so vulnerable. I was afraid of being left in the room with a body. I thought, am I crazy? I thought I'd be the next one on the table. I was petrified. I look at it now and I think, that's a natural human reaction, that closeness to death. We never want to face that, our mortality. And when you're in a room with another person who has died, you're face to face with it.
So why did you go back?
Because I thought it was an important job to do for somebody. I thought it was something that people needed in society, was someone to help them when they needed the help most. And so I went back, and I kept going back. It wasn't easy. I was the girl who had to leave the room the first time we went through an embalming at school and sit in the hall with my head between my knees. So it was a struggle for me. That part of it was a struggle. You're exposed to it a little at a time, just like you're exposed to the technical aspects of any job. You're exposed to that personal interaction a little at a time, and you do get used to it, and you also go in knowing that that's what to expect every day. It's not a surprise. You know that you're going to go to work and somebody's going to come in distraught. It is an art as far as how you prepare someone to try to make them look as natural as possible, combined with the science of it, how to mix the chemicals and universal precautions, and you consider all of the things that you learn in pathology and microbiology, but to really prepare someone and dress them and make them presentable in a way that's expected at the funeral home is very much an art, because everybody has a different and unique face, just like they had a different and unique life. It's your job to try to understand that, make it so the family can say goodbye. The person arrives as they arrive, but just making sure that their mouth and their eyes are closed, and you try to present them in a natural way. There are different methods to close somebody's mouth that you learn, and some of it is preference of the funeral home that you're working in. A lot of people think it's glue, but glue isn't usually what they use. They usually secure it together with a wire or a cord, like a thread cord. It's interesting that you ask these questions, because a lot of people ask really specific questions, and so funeral directors usually gauge their answer based on your curiosity and giving you enough knowledge without going overboard, because some people ask the question, and if you get into all the details, they think, well, I didn't want to know that. I always told families, you can ask me anything you want, and it's my job to answer you and give the information, but really think about how much information you do want. And I think that's maybe why funeral service is taboo, or talking about embalming is taboo. I think most funeral directors are comfortable with what they're doing in the prep room, and yet there's a hesitancy to discuss it in detail out of respect for those lives and the people that you see. People are entitled to the knowledge, but definitely even studying. People go to a bookstore or a coffee shop and open up their textbooks to study. Under no circumstances would I or anyone I know of have taken their embalming textbook to the local chapters and opened it on the table with the diagrams and sat down with a coffee and proceeded. You're told that, respect other people around you. This is a unique profession. This is a unique area of study. Because of that, you have to respect the boundaries. I signed up to be a funeral director. I signed up to know the things people think are trade secrets. I signed up to know about that and be exposed to it. The general public didn't. They don't want to be exposed to that on a day-to-day basis. And so you have to balance that giving of information and areas of study when you're in school with respecting who's around you. So no secrets, but definitely baby steps as far as giving information to people. People say, I've heard people move after they die, that they sit up. Things like that. People have seriously asked me. That's what they learned. That has never happened in my experience, nor has it happened in the experience of any of my past colleagues that I'm aware of. So there are a lot of things like that. There are generations who are petrified of being buried alive, or petrified of having their body prepared, being embalmed while they're still alive, because they had read stories as children that people had died and were buried alive, and there are even stories of caskets being equipped with a little bell, a little hole of a string you can pull if you wake up underground, and you can pull this bell. That's a fear of some people, and people, more than one, more than five, more than a dozen older people have said to me, I'm going to sound crazy, but this is a fear of mine. And I like that when they can express those fears to me, because hopefully I can speak to them from my experience and put their mind at ease. Other myths, that funeral directors are cold-hearted people, that we don't feel. People have said you must be cold-hearted, you must be sick, that you're interested in funeral service because of death itself. I've never met anybody like that. You're interested in funeral service because you're interested in the people who are surviving, and you're interested in paying respect and giving honor to that human life that was lived. Very, very opposite of being cold-hearted. Funeral directors feel things intensely, and that's what drives you to do your job. The saddest funeral for me, there were two. One was an infant girl. The cause of death was unknown, and she had come to an untimely death at the hands of somebody else. And that was really hard for me, because her siblings were there, young children saying goodbye, and then knowing that the possibility that they may be exposed to the same thing was heartbreaking. Yeah. So those were difficult times to remain professional and just do your job. There was another one, not quite as upsetting. It was one of my very first funerals that I had the privilege of helping with, and it was a teenage boy who had been killed. And his favorite song was "Build Me Up, Buttercup." And I thought that was so sad. That was his favorite song. He hadn't really had a chance to experience all the great things in life, you know. I think moments of beauty maybe in the strength that people have in honoring other human lives, that honoring of another human being, that respect that we pay when we come out for human life, I think is really at the core of who we are. And how we honor our dead says a lot about our society. I left funeral service. It wasn't long after I was licensed. After I was licensed, I had a unique position in the funeral home as a continuing care coordinator, helping families after the death, sorting out government paperwork and helping them get the estate in order, and also planning pre-need funerals, so helping people who either just wanted to have their funeral planned, they were retired, they were going to travel, and in case anything happened, they wanted this looked after, they wanted it paid for, or planning with people who knew that their death was imminent. That group of people, particularly the group of people who plan their own funeral services, or the family plan their funeral services in advance, knowing that death was imminent. And by imminent, I mean maybe tomorrow, but maybe in the next year. That was a group of people that affected me a lot and led me to do what I do now at the Hospice Appeal. I'm a case manager there. I'm involved with families and individuals who have been diagnosed with a life-threatening terminal illness, who are very aware of their mortality and that their time is limited. It would be sad for someone if they felt they had no more value just because they were sick. I would be sad personally if they stopped hoping for any kind of quality of life, hoping for any kind of happiness in their end days. I really have a lot of respect for people who maintain their own personality, who have had a strong personality and maintain control over things right up to the very end. To be able to do that takes an incredible amount of strength. And it also takes a lot of strength when you feel like you've given up to reach out your hand and take the help from somebody else so that you can get it back. Denial is an interesting word. Quite often I'll hear from families and people referring families, I think they're in denial. I think they're in denial. Most people I talk to who have difficulty saying maybe they've been diagnosed with cancer. They can't even say the word cancer. Or the family says we don't say the C word. So denial, I don't know if it's denial as in, no, this isn't happening to me. It's denial as in the definition I gave before are the families who say they think I'm in denial, but really what I'm going to do is wake up each day, hope for the best, and deal what I have to that day. It doesn't mean that they're denying things to the point where they're not going to make plans. And those people that a lot of us would say are in denial aren't really in denial and denying that they're ill. They're just living. And I think that's great. I mean, hospice is about living, not so much about dying. It's about living the life that you want, even though you have a disease that's going to slow you down. It's about maintaining who you are to the best of your ability, keeping in mind the losses that are happening along the way. You know, it's subjective. Well, you hear often a good death. What is a good death? And that's as unique as the number of people that walk the earth. You always think you have to be laying down, and you have to, you know, some people that's not a good death. Some people want to maintain their activities as long as possible, and it's worth the risk of a fall or something happening. That's their quality of life for them. Other people become more cautious about things they do. So a good death is really what an individual wants. Some people want very different things. A good death can be a death experienced with no pain. A good death can be a death experienced at being very aware of what's happening, even intense pain. So it depends on the person. I think of the most common fears people talk to me about is, I don't want to experience any pain. And right up there with that is, I don't want to be medicated and not conscious of what's happening around me. And so some people may opt to be conscious even though there's pain. I mean, that's not necessarily the case. Just because you have pain doesn't mean that you have to be medicated to the point of not being conscious, but sometimes that is a choice you have to make. And some people prefer to experience that pain so that they can experience the emotions and the relationships that they have. People talk about the fear of being forgotten or not being remembered. A lot of my experience is in terms of what meaning did my life have here? Who did I affect? Did I do my best for my grandchildren, spending time with them? But it may be the case with other people that have said out loud, I want to be remembered for. Not often. A lot of people are unselfish in that way. They're not as concerned about how they'll be remembered as what kind of positive and lasting effect they had on other people. You know, it's not the things you did or the things you have, it's the way you made people feel that will remain. And I think that's the most important sense that I get. They don't want to be remembered for the wrong things. They want to make sure that their relationships are in order before they go. You know, there's a certain understanding of the stress that is part of your everyday professional experience, and an understanding of why you do what you do. Because a lot of people who don't do that every day or don't deal with death or dying on a daily basis really can't understand it, how you can cope. And it's because it's really more of a calling, I think, than a profession for some people. I think it's a misconception that you are dealing every day in something dark and, like you use the word, grief-stricken. Quite often in that moment of darkness, and quite often while people are grief-stricken and mourning losses as they happen, there are moments of beauty and joy in the human experience that you can't find anywhere else. And that's not taking away from any of the pain or the suffering or the loss, just elements that come out where people are just beautiful people. The love that they have, the support that they can show for someone, the aha moments where their priorities and values are really clarified for them. And those are really beautiful moments to witness. That's part of it as well. Am I drawn to death?
I mean, one might think so, if they were to look at your career path and hear this story.
I don't think so, because doing what I do at hospice or when I was working as a funeral director, really, when I go home and close the door from work, it's a gift. Doing what I do is a gift because I appreciate life so much more. I don't go home and think about dying or being sick. I go home and think about all the great things I get to do, you know. It's taught me that death is a lot like birth. Just as there's the pain of childbirth and the pain of grieving somebody when you lose them, it just emphasizes more that beauty that you find in life, even as you're close to death, the beauty of what it means to be human, of sharing love with somebody, of sharing a relationship, of having meaningful moments. We always want to know what somebody does, what their title is. We don't often ask, how do you feel? You know, how do you feel? How are your children? Do you have enough time with your family? Do you feel like you're doing all these things? And the end of your life, whether you're 80 or whether you're 18, really clarifies where you want to be and what things take precedence. It's time that I find people are trying to balance at the end of life. It's always a reminder to make sure that in your heart you're happy with what you leave other people with.
What regrets are you finding people are most often having?
They didn't see their family enough. They didn't see their children enough. Taking some of those risks, that they listened to the way other people thought they should be rather than being who they knew they were.
How would you like to die?
Nobody wants to.